This lesson is part of a series on transitioning from optimizing your photos in Photoshop Elements to taking advantage of the many advanced features available in Photoshop CC. In this lesson, you'll see how Photoshop CC enables you to blend multiple exposures into a single high dynamic range image that retains all of the detail of a scene with a range of brightness values that exceeds the capabilities of your camera. In many situations, you may find that the dynamic range of the scene in front of your lens exceeds your camera's capabilities for capturing that range. In other words, the range between the darkest shadows and the brightest highlights is simply beyond the capability of your camera. For example, with this scene, I was not able to capture the full range of tonal values with a single image. So, in addition to capturing what you might call a normal exposure for the scene, I captured a dark exposure that retained detail in the sky, for example, as well as a bright exposure that helped maximize the amount of detail in the dark shadow areas of the photo. I can then use Photoshop to assemble these 3 or more captures into a single high dynamic range result using HDR Pro. I'll start in Adobe Bridge by clicking on the thumbnail for the first image and then holding the Shift key and clicking on the thumbnail for the last image in the sequence. And then I'll go to the Tools menu and choose Photoshop followed by Merge to HDR Pro. That will cause Adobe Bridge to send all of my captures, raw captures in this case, to Photoshop, where they will be processed and assembled into a basic HDR image. And it's important to note that while Photoshop CC allows you to assemble HDR images, the Photoshop Elements editor does not. But fortunately, we're working in Photoshop CC here, so we're able to assemble an HDR image. And now that that basic image has been assembled, we can use HDR Pro to apply tone mapping to the image. In other words, to change the overall appearance of the photo. We can start by choosing a preset from the pop-up, and that will allow us to get a basic starting point. I'll go ahead, for example, and choose Photorealistic. And that gives us a reasonably good starting point. You can explore all of the various options that are available to see which particular preset will work best for the photo that you're currently working with. This preset is a little bit strong, but I'll use it as a starting point. I'll go ahead and tone down the strength of the edge glow effect, for example, and perhaps tone down the radius just a little bit so that we don't have quite as much structure within the image. I might also tone down the slider value for detail so that we have a little bit more realistic looking image. I think I'll brighten up the shadows just a little bit by dragging the shadow slider over toward the right. I'd like to essentially be able to see a little bit more of the dark shadow areas of the photo. I think I'll also increase the value for highlights so that the highlight areas of the photo appear a little bit brighter as well. I think the saturation may be a little bit too high, so I'll tone that down a little bit. I'll maybe fine-tune the setting for gamma to adjust overall brightness and contrast for the midtones. Right about there looks a little bit better. I might increase the value just a little bit for exposure to brighten the overall image. And that's looking to be a pretty good starting point for my HDR effect. But as you can see, we have a variety of different adjustment controls that allow us to exercise great control over our HDR image. So once again, blending multiple exposures into a single HDR image allows us to overcome limitations of our camera, and Photoshop CC allows us to assemble those images into our final result using HDR Pro, a feature that is not available within the Photoshop Elements editor. So now that I've used HDR Pro in Photoshop CC to create my basic HDR image, I'll click OK in order to finalize processing. And then, of course, I can continue working with that image in a variety of ways within Photoshop.